All right. You guys ready to rock? All right, so what we're getting into today is lesson 12, the Eastern Front in Europe. So we're looking at 1942, the German offensive, to 1943, the Soviet counteroffensive. Here we have German soldiers in the Battle of Kursk. This is the largest tank battle in the history of warfare. So key topics that we are looking at: German summer of 1942 offensive, the siege in Leningrad and Moscow, the siege and battle of Stalingrad, the battle of Kursk, and the Tehran conference. Have you guys ever seen this image before? The Barmley statue of the children dancing around the crocodile. It stands as in the middle of the fountain in the middle of Stalingrad as the city burns. And then we have the Tehran conference. As always, America is sitting in the middle of the big three: Stalin, FDR, Churchill. What's that?
Stalin and
Yeah, they knew he had polio. A lot of Americans did, but he tried to keep it as discreet as possible. Like his automobile had a hand, he could accelerate on the handle of his automobile. He always, there were photographs of him in his wheelchair, but he tried to keep those images out of the public eye. So the German army in the east in 1942, they really began to abandon the plan to take Moscow, which was the Soviet capital, and Leningrad, which was the Soviet cultural capital. These are the two largest cities in the Soviet Union. Both cities, though, were under heavy siege. Sorry. So Moscow was under siege from October 2nd, 1941 to January 7th, 1942. Leningrad was under siege from September of 1941 through January of 1944. So the new motive was to move south of Kiev, take the Caucasus and take the oil fields of the Caucasus, lay siege to Stalingrad, and to control the Volga. Soviets had lost a lot of their supply. Much of the Red Army was positioned near Moscow. Germans successfully defeated the Soviets at Kharkov in May, and this push is basically, as I mentioned previously, the 1st Panzer Division is going to move to the Caucasus oil fields, and again, this spread the German lines out, and supply became a major issue again for not only the Panzer Divisions, but also the Wehrmacht infantry divisions. I believe we took a look at this map in the previous lesson on the on Operation Barbarossa. So what we're looking at here, siege of Stalingrad and the movement into the Caucasus to control the Soviet oil fields. Again, after defeating the Soviet counteroffensive in the winter of 1942, the Germans were strong enough to launch one major offensive in the spring and summer of 42. They did have, obviously, the strength to launch 3 offensives in a pincer movement at the start of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, but that strength and supply had diminished significantly as a result of the Soviet winter that they had to endure in the winter of 41 and 42. German high command decided to go after the oil fields to try to sustain the war machine and control of the Volga and control of the industrial city of Stalingrad. This is the location of Stalingrad, the location of the Volga, the location of the Caucasus, and the location of the Caspian. Stalingrad became known as Operation Blue. The Germans had to take Stalingrad in order to block the Soviet troop movements to the south. Also had to take Stalingrad to prevent the Soviets from reinforcing across the Volga. The German Sixth Army approached the Volga on August 22nd, 1942. They were led by General Field Marshal Friedrich von Paulus. They launched an air raid on the Volga with Stuka bombers and Heinkel bombers and Luftwaffe aircraft to knock out supply, and then they laid siege to Stalingrad with incendiary bombs to start fires all over the city. The Russians appeared to be trapped, but instead met the Germans with fierce resistance. As I previously mentioned, Stalin will issue the order not one step back for civilians or soldiers, so there's no retreat. They have to fight street to street and block to block. And the fighting did proceed street by street, block by block, and house by house. Soviet citizens built up defenses. The city was reduced to rubble, and movement only measured by just meters each day of the siege. By November, the Germans held 90% of the city. That is until the counteroffensive will be launched by Field Marshal Georgy Zhukov. This is a Stuka bomber in the Luftwaffe dropping dive bombs on Stalingrad. I know some of you guys probably played the game World at War, Call of Duty game. It's an older one. It's probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years old or more. If you ever played that game and you were at a level where you were attacked by a German Shepherd and you had to take the German Shepherd out and get into a house and then fight house to house to house to house to house. Anybody ever play that game? That's Stalingrad. That's what that level is, and that game captured what that campaign really looked like, because the fighting was house to house in this, and really fighting under the rubble as forces tried to control parts of the city. So again, the German armies tried to split into two forces, the 6th Army moving on Stalingrad, the 1st Panzer Division moving toward the Caucasus. One attacked Stalingrad, the other attempted to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. So here we have the Volga, the Ural, the Don, the Caspian, the oil fields, and you can see, I think everybody can understand the importance of the strategic importance of the Volga here. The Soviet Field Marshal Zhukov took command and planned a massive counterattack, much like the one that he launched in Moscow. Georgy Zhukov's nickname or moniker was the hero of Moscow and the hero of Stalingrad. The counterattack was unleashed on November 19th in what is called Operation Uranus. It came from the north and the south and caught the Germans off guard and fully surrounded Paulus's 6th Army. On November 23rd, 1942, the two-part Red Army spearheaded in a pincer movement and encircled the German 6th Army, the 3rd and 4th Romanian Army, and the 4th Panzer Division. Paulus asked Hitler for permission to break out of Stalingrad and retreat. Permission was denied. By December, he asked for permission to surrender. Permission was denied. Paulus was ordered to fight until the last man and did so until a surrender finally on February 2nd, 1943. I think the number is somewhere between 48,000 and 50,000, and only 5,000 to 6,000 of those guys ever made it back to Germany. Yeah. While the Germans were entangled in vicious fighting inside the city, of Stalingrad, the Russians prepared to counterattack Uranus. The Soviet counterattack was a success, defeating the German 6th. This shows you the ultimate goal of the Russian attack, to cut off the German armies fighting in the Caucasus. So this would prevent the 1st Panzer Division and infantry support from the Caucasus to provide support to Paulus. Turns out, though, that those armies actually dropped back in retreat. Hitler promised Paulus to send reinforcements. Reinforcements never came. In fact, all that really came were a handful of Luftwaffe planes that landed in the city to try to bring out as many people as possible. And that was pretty much it. On the top left, you can see the fighting in the rubble of the streets of Stalingrad. On the bottom left, the tanks and planes in the background set aflame. On the right, that is a really great depiction of how brutal the fighting was in the streets, fighting just on mounds of dirt, brick, rubble, stone, bodies, all littered throughout the, and burnt and mangled metal all throughout the city. And on the top right there, that is Field Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the hero of Stalingrad, the savior of Stalingrad, the savior of Moscow. So again, the German army had severe problems capturing the city and getting reinforcements. It was gritty, deadly battles. It wasn't just a battle. It was battles day in and day out in this 5-month-long siege. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed. This is a Russian assault team armed with flamethrowers and submachine guns prepared to attack. The fighting was so close that you could throw a grenade, and the grenade that you threw could get thrown back at you before it had time to explode. Fighting in the ruins. This picture on the left is one of my favorite pictures of this battle. That is a soldier, that is a Soviet soldier jumping out of a hole in the wall. Pretty impressive that they captured that shot. Keep in mind, the Soviets and the Nazis have their own correspondents on the ground as well. So they're publishing propaganda, publishing stories about the fighting going on. And they became targets as well. That is an aerial view of the ruins that was Stalingrad. So you can see statistics at the start of Operation Uranus. More German planes, more Soviet tanks, more Soviet artillery guns, but more German men, more Wehrmacht than Soviet Red Army. Hitler's troops are stopped here. This blue area represents the area taken by the Soviets in the 1942 Winter Offensive, and then it shows that the Russians captured over 300,000 Germans in Stalingrad, the Caucasus, and Kursk. It took so much time that the other German armies in the Caucasus had time to escape. The main forces that were captured were those that were fighting at Stalingrad and Kursk. So here we have the German retreat from Stalingrad back toward Poland. Obviously, the Russians did not have much greater superiority in numbers, but they did have superiority in artillery. They were almost equal in planes. They had superiority by the end of the campaign in tanks, and they launched brutal infantry assaults. Another major factor were Soviet snipers, and this is in really all campaigns. So we have Pavlyuchokov here, she was the hero of Moscow, 309 confirmed kills. She's the most deadly female sniper in history. And then we have Vasily Zaitsev. He's the most deadly sniper in Stalingrad. He's also the focal character in the book and film Enemy at the Gates. He killed 225 Axis soldiers, and he took out 11 snipers in the siege of Stalingrad. His numbers throughout the entire war they vary. He's one of the most decorated snipers in World War II. And yes, women were recruited by the Soviet Union as snipers. It wasn't just like a voluntary thing. I mean, it was voluntary, but there was specific propaganda to encourage men and women to become snipers.
You're talking about how they have the same problems.
That's a really good question. I'm sure they did. Yeah. So Mason and I were talking before about how in the Eastern Front and also the Western Front, a lot of times the potato mashers would be tossed and then they would land handle down. So they would just create like mines. But I'm sure there were parts of Stalingrad where that happened, but the thing to think about with Stalingrad is a lot of those exploded on impact. So there were just a lot of rubble. You know what I'm saying? Like I'll keep an eye. I mean, we can look into that. I'll keep an eye on that. That's a really great question. And the answer is I'm not exactly sure. I mean, if I had to guess, I would say I'm sure that just on the sheer amount of like grenades thrown, I'm sure a number of them like stuck in rubble or stuck in the ground. But yeah, it's a really great question. So again, Germans retreated from Stalingrad. In the end, German prisoners, only 5,000 of the 250,000 captured returned. So let's move on to the Battle of Kursk. This is in the spring and summer of 1943. Hitler decided on another offensive on the Eastern Front. This would lead to the greatest tank battle in history, the Battle of Kursk, July through August of 1943. The map shows here to the left the situation after the end of the Soviet 42-43 winter offensive. So this was known as Operation Citadel. The German goal was to surround and destroy all the Russian armies and reserves defending the area inside the bulge here on the left. The final strategic offensive for Germany in the east. After this, I mean, Germany's going to be defeated here. Germany's not going to win any more battles in the east. So begins the retreat back toward Berlin. And the Soviets are not going to stop the pressure until they arrive in Berlin in May of 1945. Major Soviet victory, heavy German losses in the Battle of Kursk. Tank strength was superior for the Soviets in all types, light, medium, and heavy. We have the heavy Tiger tank on the left, the Panther tank, considered one of the best tanks of World War II, on the right, the Ferdinand heavy assault gun. The Germans used new armored vehicles for their Kursk offensive here. German Tiger tanks burning here at Kursk in the forefront and in the background. Again, the Germans suffered heavy losses at the hands of the Soviets at the Battle of Kursk, and they really couldn't recover after this one. You could call this another turning point. I wouldn't put it on the level of Stalingrad. This became the first successful summer for the Soviets against the Germans, and so begins the push back toward Berlin. And you can see the heavy German losses in the Battle of Kursk here. 100,000 missing, killed, wounded Germans. So that takes us on to Tehran, codenamed Eureka, November 28th to December 1st, 1943. So just under a year after Casablanca. But remember, Stalin was not in attendance at Casablanca. All three leaders arrived with very different objectives. Churchill committed to the Italian campaign, the soft underbelly that we learned was not soft. FDR pushing for the invasion of Western Europe, which the plans are being put into place, which will be Operation Overlord, D-Day, that's where we're headed next. Stalin wanted relief on the Eastern Front. So this is the reason why D-Day, actually Tehran and D-Day have a significant connection, because what Stalin wants is by the timeline is for there to be an invasion between May and June of 1944 to alleviate pressure off the Soviets. Ironically enough, in Churchill's defense, but it's kind of hard to defend the Italian campaign, a lot of the soldiers that would have been on the Eastern Front, like 20 German divisions, were sucked out off the Eastern Front to Italy. It was just horrible losses, like 700,000 in the Italian campaign. So Tehran has a lot to do with D-Day because the Allies, even though the Allied commander, the Supreme Allied commander of D-Day was an American, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Eisenhower wanted to follow through with the promise made at Tehran, but that launch would be made in the summer, in the late spring or early summer of 44. And you have to understand the timeline, the window of this invasion, due to the weather and the geography of Normandy, was very short. And when I say short, I mean 3 days. The window for invasion was June 4th, 5th, or 6th. They missed the 4th and they missed the 5th for weather, and they're going to launch on the 6th, and they probably shouldn't have even launched on the 6th. They did it anyway, and they still didn't have the best weather. So we'll talk more. Obviously, we'll move into D-Day next time we get together. So the main outcome of Tehran was the Western Allies' commitment to open the second front against Nazi Germany, meaning the first front being Italy. The next front would be the push toward D-Day. The conference also recognized Iran's independence. It dealt with operations against Japan in the Pacific, but we were kind of going it alone in the Pacific. We had some British support and Australian support and some New Zealanders, but it was mostly an American operation in the Pacific. Issues in Turkey and Yugoslavia were also on the table due to Nazi occupation there. And then talk of post-war settlement and protocol was discussed on what's going to, how are they going to move forward. And then they're going to meet again in Yalta in February of 1945. So we'll talk about Yalta when we move into victory in Europe. And here we have Tehran. Again, we already saw this image of Stalin, FDR, and Churchill. Any questions? Everybody good? All right, cool.